It seems that inspiration so often comes from the strangest places. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre director Tobe Hooper once said that the incident that gave birth to his seminal slasher occurred while out shopping for gifts during the holiday season. He was at a hardware store, growing increasingly annoyed at the belligerent crowd of consumers. Then he spotted a display of chainsaws and imagined himself carving a path through the Yuletide masses to the cash register, where he could peacefully pay for his presents and go home. But would you believe that one famously oniric contemporary of Leatherface was born of a terrifyingly true and as yet unexplained death phenomenon? Or was a spacey soft rock hit from the 1970s the actual progenitor to this scorched and scarred dream demon? Or maybe it was both. In the late 70s and early 80s, a remarkable malady among Southeast Asian refugees had some US public health officials concerned. Having escaped persecution in their home countries, some young men, particularly those of the Hmong ethnicity, were dying in their sleep at an alarming rate. One story from the LA Times recounted the harrowing tale of a Cambodian child who was scared to go to bed for fear that he would be attacked. When he finally did sleep, however, his parents were awoken in the middle of the night to sounds of their child screaming. By the time they reached him, he was already dead. In several places in the United States where these refugees were settling, this phenomenon became the leading cause of death among Hmong men, accounting for as many as half of all fatalities between 1977 and 1981. Medical experts theorized that the cause was cardiac in nature, but no definite explanation was ever reached. These stories caught the attention of Wes Craven, a filmmaker who had already been making a name for himself in the realm of horror films. He thought these incidents could provide a fascinating premise for a new movie, but the idea was not yet fully formed. Sure, the concept of a mysterious, widespread nocturnal killer was horrifying enough in its own right, but for Craven's fictionalized version, what could be at the heart of this kind of massacre? Eventually, the director's muse took the most unlikely of forms. That's right, Gary Wright's 1975 soft rock hit Dreamweaver gave Craven's imagination the push it needed. The song was based on a poem called God, God, God by yogi and spiritual guru Paramahansa Yogananda, about how dreams are the natural process of the unconscious mind to remain in tune with a benevolent deity. Craven twisted the idea, imagining a situation in which the master of our dreams is malevolent and bloodthirsty. The filmmaker's villain finally began to take shape.
Freddie, the name, was the name of a kid who used to beat me up quite frequently. Krueger sounded very German and reminded me of one of the big war plants in Nazi Germany, and also it was an extension of Krug, who was the lead character in Last House on the Left. Freddie's hat was exactly the hat of a man who had scared me when I was a little kid, who I think was a drunk walking down the street. His sweater colors were out of an article I read in Scientific American, that these two colors were the most difficult for the human cornea or human eye to put side by side. The claws were the sort of pièce de résistance, and it was like, well, what does he have? Does he have a knife? Does he have a sickle? I think at that time we had a cat, and I just saw the cat doing this. You know, I was like, oh, yeah, right.
Freddy Krueger was born, embodying every ounce of the vengeful god Craven imagined in his perversion of Gary Wright's pop ballad.
Please, God.
This is God.
And on November 9th, 1984, Freddie made his big screen debut in A Nightmare on Elm Street. The film follows Nancy Thompson, played by Heather Langenkamp, a high school girl from the fictional Springwood, Ohio, who is struggling with extremely vivid nightmares about being pursued by a badly scarred man in a dirty hat. She soon learns that all her friends are dreaming of the same figure, and before long, the teenagers begin being killed one by one in their sleep, their bodies showing stabbing and slashing wounds consistent with the knives affixed to the nightmarish entity's glove. Eventually, it is revealed that the monster was once a man named Fred Krueger, a serial child murderer who was acquitted on a technicality and became the victim of vigilante justice by the parents of Elm Street. It seems that Krueger has returned to enact vengeance on the teenage children of these parents, and since no one believes her, it becomes Nancy's job to dispatch the dream demon and save her own life.
booby traps and improvised anti-personnel devices? Well, what are you reading that for?
I'm into survival.
A Nightmare on Elm Street was an instant success, and over the next few years it became impossible to get away from the grotesque image of Freddy Krueger. Along with several sequels, an absolute requirement of any successful horror film, there were toys, Halloween costumes, board games, and even a studio album featuring the vocal stylings of Krueger himself, actor Robert Englund. And of course, in those days where there's money to be made on an intellectual property, there are video games. 1989 saw the release of 2 titles based on A Nightmare on Elm Street, one for Commodore 64 and DOS systems, and the other for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Today, we'll be looking at the NES version. Released in the United States between the 5th and 6th movies in the series, A Nightmare on Elm Street is not so much based on one particular film from the franchise, but rather takes the core premise and builds a game around it, sprinkling in nods to the first 3 movie entries specifically. For example, the very impressive pixel art on the title screen depicts a version of Freddy Krueger with his signature blades protruding directly from his fingers, as opposed to the classic glove. This variation of the character is from A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge. Jumping into the game, the player takes control of a nameless teenager who must enter a number of Springwood landmarks in search of Freddy's bones, a plot point lifted from A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, Dream Warriors.
You and I are going on a little scavenger hunt.
The junkyard, the cemetery, and the local high school will all be explored in pursuit of a complete skeleton. But each game begins with the player entering 3 neighborhood houses in random order. On this quest, the player will encounter a variety of enemies that have little to do with the movies, including a zombie-like shambler, wild animals, skeletons, and demons, to name a few. These foes are dispatched with anywhere from 1 to 4 punches, the exact number apparently generated randomly. The basic attack mechanic takes a bit of getting used to, as there is a brief wind-up period that feels very similar to early Castlevania games. Granted, the teenager's fist has nothing on the range of a whip. Jumping is a bit more slippery in contrast as well, despite the mid-air control that the player retains during a jump, something that feels more like Mega Man than Simon Belmont. The comparisons to Konami's influential actioner don't end there, however. Each stage presents the player with platforming challenges and ends with a boss encounter, in which victory provides a key to the next area. One interesting feature in the game is the sleep meter, which continually depletes but will drain more rapidly if the teenager stops moving. Cups of coffee can be obtained to refill the bar, but once it finally runs out, the player character is whisked away to the dream world, where enemies take on sinister new forms that generally require more hits to defeat. This feels remarkably similar to the day-night cycle from Castlevania II, Simon's Quest. You're not completely helpless in this world of nightmares, however, as collecting Dream Warrior icons in the waking world grant the character with special powers in the dream world. This concept is yet another reference to the aforementioned second sequel, in which the young ensemble of would-be victims harnesses their ability to control the circumstances of their own dreams and do battle with Krueger.
In the name of Lorik, Prince of Elves, demon be gone!
The player can take on 3 new forms, including the Acrobat, who can somersault high in the air and hurl javelins, the Shadow Warrior, who performs a flying kick while jumping and throws shurikens, and the Necromancer, who can hover and shoot magic projectiles. Again, this imitates another feature from a Castlevania title, specifically the switchable characters from Castlevania III, Dracula's Curse. Finding a radio in the dream world will wake up the teenager and refill the sleep meter, but a player who lingers too long will soon hear that familiar, ominous lullaby, signifying that Freddy is on his way. These encounters are brief and not particularly challenging if using a Dream Warrior power-up, but the constant threat of Krueger's appearance is effectively anxiety-inducing. If the player can survive 7 stages, each more difficult than the last, and some featuring very frustrating jumps and unavoidable hazards, they'll face a boss rush of all previous incarnations of Freddy, followed by the final encounter with the man himself. This ultimate battle plays out exactly like his appearances when a player spends too long in the dream world, so a quick switch to the necromancer should see Freddy defeated quite easily. The teenager then tosses Krueger's bones in the furnace, ending his reign of terror once and for all. Maybe. A Nightmare on Elm Street for NES has received largely negative to middling reviews from critics, but I feel that its reputation is somewhat undeserved. The mechanics aren't as sound as the Castlevania games that it's aping, and the collision detection is admittedly poor, especially when it comes to the Dream Warrior's projectile attacks. But I feel the title still has something to offer, especially for fans of the source material. I think that some of this derision comes from the fact that the game was published by LJN, a toy company that became somewhat infamous for its underwhelming video games based on existing properties. But the game was actually developed by Rare, a British company that would eventually see widespread acclaim for games such as Killer Instinct, GoldenEye 007, and Banjo-Kazooie. Visually, the game is well presented, the sprite work is decent, and the distorted perspective of the buildings along Elm Street creates a sense of looming dread that is appropriately dreamlike. The music is a notable highlight as well, provided by renowned composer David Wise, who went on to help create beloved scores for games such as Donkey Kong Country. A Nightmare on Elm Street also allows up to 4 players to join in the action with the 4-score peripheral device. In this configuration, 2 male and 2 female teenagers are represented, mirroring the central cast of the original A Nightmare on Elm Street film. 4-player concurrent play was an uncommon feature on the console, accounting for only 25 games, or just over 3% of all official releases. If it's not clear by now, let me lay it on the line. I'm as much of a movie guy as I am a game guy. And even more specifically, I'm a horror guy. So when I tell you that A Nightmare on Elm Street is my favorite horror franchise of all time, please understand that this comes with no small amount of consideration. I'll freely admit that the quality of the films is less than consistent, but what keeps me coming back to these movies is the creativity allowed by its very premise. Although structurally similar to its slasher film brethren, few franchises can as easily append the fantasy genre to their list of descriptors. And this is ultimately the strength of the series for me. No less than 3 sequels, a crossover with the Friday the 13th franchise, and a remake have come and gone since the arrival of A Nightmare on Elm Street for NES. And although Freddie has popped up in a couple of unrelated game releases, he's yet to star in another title of his own. For shame, I say, as the boundless realm of our dreams could easily provide the canvas for an infinitely imaginative interactive horror experience, the likes of which has never been seen. I guess all a willing developer would need is a little inspiration.